There is a quiet kind of moment that most people never notice. It does not happen in loud conversations or dramatic scenes. It happens in silence, in the space between thoughts, where a person sits alone and begins to reflect more deeply than usual. Imagine someone going through an ordinary day, speaking normally, behaving calmly, yet internally, something feels different. Not chaotic, not rushed, just thoughtful, more observant, more aware. One evening, after a long day filled with routine interactions and surface-level distractions, the mind finally becomes still, and in that stillness, a single presence begins to stand out more clearly than everything else, not because of something extreme that happened, but because of a consistent emotional impression that has quietly grown over time. Memories replay softly. Conversations are remembered in fragments. Small moments that once seemed ordinary now carry unexpected emotional weight. At first, the person tries to dismiss it as simple overthinking, but the mind does not let it go so easily. Instead, it keeps returning to the same reflection, the same emotional question, the same internal awareness that something about this connection feels psychologically significant. Not in a dramatic way, but in a deeply human way that is difficult to explain out loud. Days pass, and outwardly nothing appears unusual. Communication may remain normal or slightly quieter. Behavior may seem more composed, even distant at times. But internally, a subtle process has begun. The person is not reacting impulsively. They are observing their own emotions, asking themselves questions they do not share with anyone, trying to understand why one particular presence occupies more mental space than expected. In quiet moments, the mind compares feelings with past experiences. It notices how this connection feels different from others, not louder, not more intense in a superficial way, but deeper, more reflective, almost as if it touches a part of the psyche that prefers sincerity over noise. This realization does not create instant clarity. Instead, it creates pause. That pause becomes reflection. Reflection becomes evaluation. And evaluation slowly turns into a serious internal consideration. Not because of pressure, not because of external influence, but because the emotional meaning of the connection feels real enough to deserve careful thought. The person begins to understand that this is not just about another interaction. It is about how this connection makes them think, feel, and become more self-aware. There is also a quiet tension within. One part of the mind wants certainty and clarity. Another part wants time and emotional safety. This inner dialogue continues silently, shaping thoughts in ways that are invisible from the outside. No dramatic expressions, no sudden confessions, just a steady psychological awareness forming in the background. Late at night, when distractions fade, the mind returns to the same realization again and again. Not with urgency, but with seriousness. Because deep down, the person senses that this is not a casual emotional experience. It is something that requires understanding before any clear step can be taken. And so, instead of rushing, they think. Instead of reacting, they reflect. Instead of speaking impulsively, they observe their own emotional truth. Inner conflict is rarely loud. It does not always appear as dramatic words or visible actions. Most of the time, it unfolds quietly within the mind, where thoughts, emotions, and past experiences begin to interact in a subtle but intense way. When someone is approaching a major decision about a meaningful connection, the first sign is not certainty, it is hesitation. Not because the feeling is weak, but because it is psychologically significant. A meaningful bond does not get processed on the surface level. The mind treats it differently. Instead of reacting instantly, the psyche pauses and starts examining everything it has experienced in relation to that person. Small memories gain weight. Conversations are replayed internally. Emotional reactions are analyzed. This is the beginning of inner conflict, where two psychological forces are trying to find balance. One part of the mind may feel drawn, emotionally connected, and deeply affected. Another part may feel cautious, uncertain, or even afraid of the depth of that impact. This tension creates a state where the person is not confused in a careless way, but rather reflective in a serious way. The conflict is not about indecision alone, it is about emotional evaluation. According to the ideas of Carl Jung, the unconscious mind plays a powerful role when a connection touches something deep inside. When someone begins to feel psychologically influenced by another person, it activates inner layers that are usually hidden. Old emotional patterns, past experiences, and personal fears quietly emerge. This does not happen with ordinary interactions. It happens when the connection feels meaningful enough to challenge the inner self. Inner conflict often begins when the emotional experience does not fully match the person's expectations about themselves. For example, someone who is used to emotional control may suddenly feel emotionally exposed. Someone who values independence may begin to feel attachment. This creates psychological tension, not because something is wrong, but because the experience is new on a deeper level. During this phase, behavior may become slower, more thoughtful, or even distant, not as a sign of rejection, but as a natural psychological response. The mind is trying to protect itself while also trying to understand the emotional reality of the connection. It is like standing between two internal voices. One voice says to move forward, and the other says to pause and reflect. This internal dialogue can feel heavy, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, persistent way. The person may appear calm externally, yet internally they are weighing emotional meaning against personal fears. They may question whether the connection is safe, whether it is genuine, or whether it will change their emotional stability. These questions are not superficial. They come from a deeper psychological need for clarity. Another important aspect of inner conflict is that it is often misunderstood as emotional withdrawal. In reality, it is usually a form of psychological processing. When the mind senses that a decision could impact identity, emotional security, or future direction, it naturally slows down. This slowing down is not avoidance. It is internal examination. The conflict also becomes stronger when the emotional impact of the connection feels real rather than temporary. The psyche does not create deep conflict over casual interactions. It does so when the bond has psychological weight. This weight forces the individual to confront personal truths they may not have fully acknowledged before. There is also a subtle fear involved in inner conflict, not necessarily fear of the person, but fear of emotional change. Meaningful connections can shift how someone sees themselves, how they think about vulnerability, and how they approach emotional closeness. That shift can feel both compelling and unsettling at the same time. As the conflict continues, the person may move between moments of clarity and moments of uncertainty. One day they may feel emotionally certain, and another day they may retreat into reflection again. This fluctuation is a natural psychological process, not a sign of instability. It simply means the mind is still searching for alignment between feeling and understanding. Over time, inner conflict becomes less about external circumstances and more about internal truth. The person begins to ask deeper questions that are not spoken out loud, questions about emotional authenticity, personal readiness, and the long-term meaning of the connection. These questions operate beneath the surface, shaping thoughts and behavior quietly. In many cases, the stronger the emotional significance, the deeper the inner conflict becomes. Not because the connection is unclear, but because it is meaningful enough to require genuine psychological consideration, where the mind and emotions slowly attempt to reach a point of inner agreement without rushing the decision. Psychological distance is often misunderstood because it does not look emotional on the surface. It can appear as silence, reduced communication, or a shift in behavior that feels colder than before. But distance is not always a sign of emotional absence. In many cases, it is a sign that something deeper is being processed internally. The mind pulls back not to disconnect, but to observe and understand what it is truly feeling. When a connection becomes emotionally significant, the psyche rarely reacts in a simple or linear way. Instead of moving closer immediately, the mind sometimes creates space. This space allows the person to examine their reactions without external pressure. It is a quiet form of psychological evaluation, where emotions are not rejected but carefully studied. This kind of distance usually begins when the emotional impact of someone feels stronger than expected. The individual may not be fully prepared for how deeply the connection affects their thoughts, mood, or inner state. Rather than expressing everything outwardly, they step inward. This inward movement is not emotional detachment. It is emotional awareness unfolding privately. According to the psychological perspective of Carl Jung, the psyche tends to withdraw into reflection when it encounters something meaningful. The unconscious mind does not rush decisions tied to emotional significance. Instead, it creates a pause where feelings, fears, and personal values can be examined beneath the surface. This reflective pause often looks like distance from the outside. Another important layer is emotional safety. When someone feels deeply affected by another person, they may instinctively create distance to protect their emotional balance. Not because the connection is unwanted, but because it feels powerful enough to influence their inner world. Distance becomes a psychological buffer that allows them to process emotions without feeling overwhelmed. This evaluation phase can involve replaying past interactions in the mind. Small details are remembered. Words, reactions, and emotional moments are mentally reviewed. The person is not ignoring the connection. They are analyzing its meaning and its impact on their emotional life. This type of internal reflection requires mental space, which naturally reduces outward expression. Psychological distance can also emerge when a person senses that a decision about the connection may affect their identity or future direction. Meaningful bonds do not only influence emotions, they influence self-perception. The mind begins to ask deeper questions about compatibility, emotional depth, and long-term significance. These questions are rarely spoken, but they shape behavior in subtle ways. During this period, emotional signals may appear inconsistent. There may be moments of closeness followed by moments of quiet distance. This fluctuation is not necessarily confusion. It is often a sign that the person is balancing emotional attraction with internal reflection. They are trying to understand whether their feelings align with their inner values and psychological readiness. It is also important to recognize that true indifference usually looks different from psychological distance. Indifference is emotionally flat and disengaged. Psychological distance, on the other hand, often carries a sense of seriousness. The person may become quieter, more thoughtful, or more observant rather than emotionally absent. Their behavior reflects internal processing rather than emotional disinterest. Another subtle aspect is that distance allows emotional clarity to form naturally. When someone stays constantly engaged without reflection, their decisions can become impulsive. Emotional truth is not about dramatic expressions or constant reassurance. It is about the subtle consistency of feelings that develop over time. The unconscious quietly tracks patterns such as emotional presence, authenticity, and psychological comfort. Even when the conscious mind tries to remain neutral, the unconscious continues forming impressions based on emotional depth rather than surface behavior. According to the psychological insights of Carl Jung, the unconscious mind stores experiences in symbolic and emotional forms rather than literal narratives. This means that the mind does not just remember events, it remembers how those events felt. When someone becomes emotionally significant, the unconscious associates that person with certain emotional states, inner reactions, and personal reflections that go beyond simple memory. This process explains why someone may not always react immediately to a meaningful connection. On the surface, they may appear calm or neutral, but internally, the unconscious is actively processing emotional signals. It is comparing present experiences with past emotional patterns, personal values, and inner expectations. This comparison happens silently, without conscious effort. Another important aspect is that the unconscious is sensitive to authenticity. Surface behavior can be observed and analyzed logically, but emotional sincerity is sensed on a deeper level. If a connection feels genuine, the unconscious registers that sincerity, even if the conscious mind hesitates. This creates an internal tension where logic seeks clarity, while the unconscious already senses emotional significance. The unconscious also responds strongly to emotional consistency. Repeated experiences of emotional comfort, understanding, or psychological impact gradually strengthen the inner perception of meaning. This does not require constant communication or visible intensity. Even subtle interactions can carry deep emotional weight if they resonate internally. The unconscious gathers these impressions slowly, forming an overall emotional truth about the connection. Fear and past experiences also influence how the unconscious evaluates emotional truth. If someone has experienced emotional disappointment before, their unconscious mind may become cautious when a new meaningful bond forms. This caution does not erase the emotional impact. Instead, it slows down the process of acceptance, allowing the psyche to observe carefully before reaching any internal conclusion. Surface behavior can sometimes appear inconsistent because the conscious mind and unconscious mind do not always move at the same pace. The conscious mind seeks logical understanding, while the unconscious responds to emotional depth. This difference can create hesitation, reflection, or psychological distance, even when the emotional truth is quietly recognized on a deeper level. Another subtle detail is that the unconscious values emotional alignment more than external perfection. A connection does not need to be flawless to feel meaningful. What matters more is whether it resonates with the person's inner emotional reality. If the interaction feels psychologically real and emotionally impactful, the unconscious gives it importance regardless of minor external imperfections. The unconscious also processes meaning through intuition. This intuition is not random. It is formed from accumulated emotional experiences, internal values, and subconscious observations. When someone feels that a connection is significant without fully explaining why, it is often the unconscious recognizing emotional truth before the conscious mind can logically articulate it. Over time, the unconscious continues shaping perception quietly. It influences emotional reactions, thoughts, and even decision-making without being directly visible. While the conscious mind may question, analyze, or delay, the unconscious gradually builds a deeper understanding of the emotional reality of the connection based on how it genuinely feels rather than how it merely appears on the surface. Silence is often misread because people naturally associate words with clarity and quietness with emotional withdrawal. In reality, silence can carry a depth that spoken communication sometimes cannot express. When someone becomes silent in the presence of a meaningful emotional situation, it does not automatically indicate rejection. More often, it signals that something important is being processed internally, where thoughts and emotions are being examined with care rather than reacted to impulsively. Human beings do not always respond to significant feelings through immediate expression. Some experiences are too complex to be understood instantly, especially when they touch deeper emotional layers. In such moments, silence becomes a psychological space where reflection can occur without external pressure. It allows the mind to observe feelings instead of reacting to them too quickly. When a connection begins to hold emotional weight, the psyche tends to slow down rather than speed up. This slowing down can naturally reduce outward communication, not because the person has lost interest, but because their inner attention has shifted toward understanding what they truly feel. Words require clarity, and clarity often forms gradually through internal reflection rather than immediate conversation. According to the ideas of Carl Jung, the psyche values introspection when dealing with emotionally meaningful experiences. Silence, in this sense, is not emptiness. It is an active inner process where the conscious and unconscious mind are attempting to align. Instead of expressing premature conclusions, the person withdraws into thought, allowing emotional truth to emerge naturally. Another important aspect of silence is emotional sensitivity. When someone senses that a situation or connection is psychologically significant, they may become more cautious in their expression. Speaking without full understanding can feel emotionally dishonest. Silence then becomes a form of sincerity, where the person avoids saying something superficial while their deeper feelings are still forming. Reflection also requires mental energy and focus. Continuous external communication can interrupt the internal process of emotional evaluation. By becoming quieter, the person creates space for inner observation. They may revisit past interactions, analyze emotional reactions, and examine how the connection influences their thoughts and sense of self. This internal dialogue often unfolds quietly and privately. Silence can also be a sign of emotional respect toward the situation. When a person treats a connection as meaningful, they are less likely to respond casually or impulsively. Instead of reacting based on temporary emotions, they choose to reflect before expressing anything definite. This thoughtful pause may appear distant on the surface, but internally, it is often filled with serious consideration. There is also a psychological difference between avoidance and reflective silence. Avoidance usually carries a sense of emotional disengagement, where the person intentionally distances themselves without internal processing. Reflective silence, however, carries awareness. The person remains mentally engaged even if they are not outwardly expressive. Their attention is directed inward rather than outward. Another layer to consider is emotional complexity. Not all feelings are simple or easily defined. When someone experiences mixed emotions such as curiosity, caution, attachment, and uncertainty at the same time, silence becomes a natural response. It allows the mind to sort through these emotional layers without forcing immediate conclusions that may not yet feel accurate. Fear of misunderstanding can also contribute to silence. When emotions feel significant, the person may hesitate to express themselves until they are sure of what they truly think and feel. This hesitation is not emotional rejection. It is a careful approach to communication, where words are held back until they genuinely reflect the inner state, rather than temporary confusion. Silence can therefore function as a protective psychological space. It protects both emotional clarity and inner stability. By not reacting instantly, the person avoids making decisions based on fleeting emotions or external pressure. Instead, they allow their understanding to develop gradually through reflection and self-awareness. Over time, reflective silence often leads to deeper emotional clarity rather than emotional disappearance. The person is not disconnected from the experience. They are mentally and emotionally engaged in a quieter way, allowing their inner thoughts, feelings, and perceptions to settle and organize before expressing anything outwardly in a way that truly aligns with their internal understanding. Fear of vulnerability is one of the most subtle psychological forces that can delay a decisive step in any meaningful connection. It does not always appear as obvious fear. Instead, It often shows up as hesitation, overthinking, emotional restraint, or a careful distance that seems confusing on the surface. The person may feel deeply affected internally, yet still move slowly because opening up emotionally requires a level of inner exposure that the mind naturally treats with caution. When a connection begins to feel emotionally significant, it challenges a person's sense of emotional safety. Vulnerability means allowing another person to see thoughts, emotions, and inner realities that are usually kept private. For many individuals, this is not a simple act. It involves trust, emotional risk, and the possibility of being misunderstood or emotionally affected in ways they cannot fully control. The mind is designed to protect emotional stability. When vulnerability becomes necessary for a deeper step, the psyche does not rush forward without evaluation. Instead, it pauses and begins to assess whether it is safe to be emotionally open. This pause is not a lack of feeling. It is often a sign that the emotional experience is real enough to matter. According to the psychological perspective of Carl Jung, the human psyche contains both conscious intentions and unconscious fears. Even when someone consciously feels drawn toward a meaningful connection, the unconscious may still carry memories of past emotional experiences. These memories shape how safe or risky vulnerability feels in the present moment. Past emotional experiences play a quiet but powerful role in this hesitation. If someone has previously experienced emotional disappointment, misunderstanding, or emotional pressure, their mind may become more cautious when a new meaningful bond forms. This caution is not necessarily directed at the present situation. It is a protective pattern developed over time to maintain emotional balance. In the end, when someone is making a big decision about you, it is rarely a simple or sudden process. It is usually a quiet psychological journey that unfolds beneath the surface, shaped by reflection, emotional truth, inner conflict, and personal transformation. What may appear as distance, silence, hesitation, or careful behavior is often not a sign of indifference, but a sign of seriousness. The mind slows down when something feels meaningful because it wants to understand the depth of its own emotions before taking any decisive step. Human psychology does not rush what feels significant. Instead, it observes, evaluates, and processes internally. The unconscious weighs emotional impact more than external appearances. Vulnerability introduces caution. Reflection creates silence. Inner conflict delays impulsive reactions. All of these are natural responses when a connection touches deeper layers of the psyche. As explored through the psychological lens of Carl Jung, meaningful emotional decisions are often tied to self-awareness and inner development rather than momentary feelings. A person may not immediately express what they feel because their inner world is still organizing thoughts, emotions, and personal truths. This does not mean the connection lacks importance. It often means the opposite. It means the experience is psychologically significant enough to require genuine internal alignment. Serious decisions about meaningful bonds are shaped more by emotional authenticity than by surface reactions. The mind seeks clarity before commitment, understanding before expression, and stability before